This is part 66 of SQL Server tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss writing rerunnable SQL scripts. Please watch part 65 before proceeding. So, what is a rerunnable SQL script? A rerunnable SQL script is a script that when run more than once will not throw errors. Let's understand what we mean by this statement with an example. Let's flip to SQL Server Management Studio. Notice that here we have this create table script. This is going to create this table TBL employee. I want this table to be created in this sample database, so that's why we are using use sample. So this table is going to be created within the sample database. So when I run this query, at the moment notice that I don't have this table TBL employee. So when I run this the first time, this is going to execute successfully and the table gets created. So when we refresh this, notice that we have the table within that sample database. Then if I try to run this query once again, look at what's going to happen. We get an error. Why? Because we have the table already. That's why it says there is already an object named TBL employee. Okay, so this script right here is not rerunnable. So how do we make this script rerunnable? Pretty straightforward. Check for the existence of the table. If the table doesn't exist, only then try to create the table, else print a message stating the table already exists. So obviously the next question is, how do we check for the existence of a table? In the previous session we discussed using information_schema.tables view to list all the tables in a SQL Server database. So we're going to make use of that view to check for the existence of the table. So look at this query, select star from information_schema.tables, where table name is equal to the name of the table that we are trying to create. So if that table exists, this query is going to return a row. And then we are passing the result of this query to this function exists. So if at all, if there is anything returned by this query, then this exists function is going to return true, otherwise it's going to return false. So basically look at this expression right here, if not exists. So if the table does not exist, then go ahead and create the table, print a message stating the table is successfully created, else print a message stating the table already exists. Pretty straightforward. Let's look at this query in action. And to just speed things up, I have this query already typed, so let me copy and paste that in SQL Server Management Studio. So since we already have the table TBL employee, when we execute this query, look at this. First of all, this query, when we execute this query, we get a row back and we are passing that to this exist function. So obviously, this is going to check, this expression right here is going to check if the table is there or not. And if the table is not there, then create the table, else print this message. Straightforward. So let's execute this. Look at that, table TBL employee already exists. On the other hand, if I delete this table and execute this query, notice that table TBL employee is successfully created. Refresh this, TBL employee there. I execute this query once again, table TBL employee already exists. No matter how many times we execute this, we don't get an error. So this script is rerunnable. Now, to check for the existence of the table, we have used information_schema.tables. There is another way to check for the existence of the table. You can simply use this function, this SQL Server built-in function, object ID, and pass the name of the object. Here the name of the object is our table name. So if this object already exists in SQL Server database, then it will have an ID, and this function is simply going to return that ID. So if there is an ID for that object, then we know the table is already there. If it is null, then we know we don't have a table there, so we'll go ahead and create that. So just to show you that, we already have the table right here, this table TBL employee. So when we say select object ID and then pass the name of the object, which is TBL employee, and then look at this, when I execute this query, I get the ID of that object. Okay, so if that is null, if object ID for a given object is null, then we know for sure that object doesn't exist. We can go ahead and create that object, in this case table, and then print a message saying table created successfully, else we'll print a message saying the table already exists. And just to show you that in action, let me copy this query, and paste that within SQL Server Management Studio. The table is already there, so when we execute this, table TBL employee already exists. Alright, now depending on what we want to achieve, sometimes we may want to drop and recreate the table. So if the table already exists, we want to drop and recreate it. Okay, this is especially true if we are building some test databases. Okay, so how do we drop and recreate the tables? Again, check for the existence of the table and then only drop the table. Because if you don't check for the existence of the table and then try to drop a table, and if the table doesn't exist, you will get again an error. So that's why when dropping a table, check if the table already exists. And again, to check for the existence of the table, you can either use information underscore schema.tables view or this object ID function. Okay, notice that if object ID, then drop the table. So if that is not null, then we know that object is there, in which case go ahead and drop it and then recreate the table. Okay, let's look at that query in action. So let's copy this to SQL Server Management Studio. So the table is already there, so when I execute this, it's going to drop the table and then recreate that. Okay, so no matter how many times we execute this, it's going to drop the table, recreate it, drop the table, recreate it. Okay, now you might be wondering, let me actually delete this. If you don't have this condition right here, the check to make sure that the object is there before we try to delete, if we don't have that condition, and notice that we don't have the table TBL employee. Now if I try to execute this, we will get an error. Why? Because the table doesn't exist anymore. So the query errors out right there, and then this doesn't get executed. That's why make sure you check for the existence of the table before you try to drop it. Let's look at another example. Now this script right here is not rerunnable. Look at what the script is trying to do. It's trying to add a column email address to this table TBL employee. When we run the script the first time, it's going to run without any problem if that column doesn't exist. If I run it again, then it's going to throw an error because a table cannot have two columns with the same name. So this script again is not rerunnable. So how do we make the script rerunnable? Obviously check for the existence of that column. So how do you check for the existence of the column? Again, you can use this information underscore schema.columns. We discussed about this in previous session as well. And notice that we are checking the name of the column. Not only that, actually let's look at that query in action. So when I execute this, select star from information underscore schema dot columns, where column name is equal to email address. So when we execute this, we didn't get anything. Why? Because we don't have that column there. So let me actually execute this query. So it's going to add that column to our table TBL employee. So if we expand that, we should have email address column right there. So now when we execute this, we should get error. Look at that, the column name is email address, and we are also having here table name filter, and that's very important because if there is another table with the same column name, you will get that true as well. That's why we need to filter on table name. So if that column email address doesn't exist on this table TBL employee, only then try to add that column. Okay, and notice that here I have another condition, table schema. Again, this is very important, especially if your SQL Server has multiple schemas. Okay, in multiple schemas you can have same table name and same column name. So obviously you don't want to be altering a table that is present in a different schema. Okay, so that's why it's very important to check the schema as well, just in case if your SQL Server has got multiple schemas. If that's not the case, it's enough if you check just the table name and the column name. Again, this script is rerunnable. No matter how many times you run, this is not going to throw an error. If the column exists, it's going to print that message. If it doesn't exist, it's going to add that column. Again, to check for the column existence, you can either use this view or you can use this column length function. Okay, again, just like object ID function. So column length, you pass the name of the table and the column that you're looking for. If that column length function is not null, then we know that the column already exists on that table, else the column doesn't exist, in which case you can have that the script to add the column to the table. Alright, on this slide you can find resources for ASP.NET C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.